Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Imagine sitting at your own kitchen table, staring at a blank spot where a birthday cake should be, while the clock ticks past midnight and nobody in your family even notices. That was me at 16. It wasn't some tragedy on the news or a distant story whispered by a neighbor. It was the very real, very ordinary neglect that crept into my life until it felt normal. My parents forgot my birthday, and at the time, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. They were busy. Dad was caught up in work, Mom was juggling bills and household chores, and my younger sister Rachel had soccer practice that kept everyone distracted. I told myself it was just bad timing and that next year would be different. The truth is, I wanted to believe that one forgotten day didn't mean anything about how they felt about me. I remember brushing my own hair in the bathroom mirror that night, whispering happy birthday under my breath and laughing as though it was some silly inside joke. 16 is supposed to feel special, a milestone, but instead I went to bed with the glow of my phone screen on my face, scrolling through classmates' pictures of birthday dinners, cakes with sparklers, and cars covered in balloons. Mine was just silence. 17 came, and again, nothing. I had been hopeful that the sting from the year before would have reminded them, maybe prompted Mom to scribble something on the calendar or Dad to grab a card from the gas station on his way home. But when I walked downstairs that morning, the only thing on the table was Rachel's science project and a list of groceries. Nobody looked up, nobody said a word. That was when the numbness started, the kind that convinces you it's safer to laugh it off than admit it hurts. I told my friends at school that I didn't care about birthdays, that they were for kids, but deep down, I hated how much I longed for someone to just light a candle and remember I existed. 18 is supposed to mark adulthood, the threshold where you step out of childhood and into your own identity. My parents remembered Rachel's 18th birthday with such enthusiasm that I thought maybe, just maybe, they would do the same for me. But on my own 18th, they acted as though the day was no different from any other. Dad came home late, tossing his briefcase onto the couch with a grunt. Mom rushed between phone calls and laundry, and Rachel kept talking about her upcoming prom dress. I sat on the porch that night, staring at the streetlight while the air smelled faintly of barbecues from nearby houses, each glow of laughter and clinking plates reminding me that somewhere else, someone was being celebrated. I was a shadow in my own house. 19 passed in the same silence, though by then I had stopped expecting anything. I bought myself a small cupcake from the bakery down the street, stuck a crooked candle in the middle, and whispered another birthday wish that I knew would never reach anyone's ears. By that point, I had developed a kind of private ritual: get through the day, act unbothered, and swallow the bitterness that threatened to spill out every time Rachel pranced through the door with balloons and laughter for her own birthdays. She never once asked why I never celebrated mine, or if she did, she quickly dropped it, like the subject itself was embarrassing. Maybe she knew and chose not to care. By the time I turned 20, the 5th year in a row, it wasn't just an oversight anymore, it was a statement. They didn't forget. They didn't care. My father could schedule golf outings 3 weeks in advance. My mother never missed Rachel's games, and the calendar on the fridge was filled with notes about carpool, dentist appointments, and every holiday imaginable. My name, though, might as well have been erased from their lives. That day, I went upstairs after dinner, laid on my bed staring at the ceiling, and I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't sadness anymore. It wasn't longing. It was anger so sharp it almost felt clean, like the moment a wound stops bleeding and just burns. I replayed every forgotten year in my head, every moment where I let myself believe the next time would be different, and I realized I had been a fool. No one forgets 5 birthdays in a row unless they choose to. It wasn't about busyness or distraction. It was about value. Rachel was their golden child, the one who received cake after cake, party after party, while I faded into the background like an afterthought. That night, I swore to myself I would stop making excuses for them. If they forgot me once more, I wouldn't just shrug and pretend I didn't care. I would stop waiting for their attention, stop begging for crumbs of recognition. I would do something they could never ignore, something that would remind them I was not a ghost living in their house. I didn't know exactly what shape that promise would take, but I felt it coil inside me like a fuse waiting to be lit. And when Rachel's 18th birthday arrived, with balloons tied to the mailbox and neighbors filling the driveway, I saw exactly what I needed to do. That was the moment I understood my silence was over, and that their celebration would mark the beginning of my revenge. The morning of Rachel's 18th birthday started with the kind of suburban choreography that makes neighbors lean on their rakes and offer congratulatory nods, because there were balloons bobbing on the mailbox like cheery sentries, folding tables unfolding on the lawn as if summoned by a drumbeat, and the smell of something overly sugared rising from the kitchen where my mother handled frosting bags like scalpels while my father argued with a bungee cord and a giant velvet bow that could have swallowed a small dog, and through all of it I moved like a stagehand who knows the cues better than the actors yet never gets to speak into the microphone. I kept my face neutral, helpful even, because I had learned long ago that the fastest way to be accused of ruining a day was to let the truth touch the air, so I carried trays, fetched napkins, and listened to my mother's running commentary about guest lists, parking, and how the neighbors from across the street always brought a pie that tasted like guilt, while my father checked his watch and whispered into his phone in that conspiratorial voice men use when they're sure they're about to pull off a memorable surprise. The irony, of course, was that the surprise was never for me, not once, not even accidentally, and the only thing that would be memorable about the day, at least from my vantage point, was the precise instant I realized I wasn't going to swallow another crumb of quiet just to keep everyone else's appetite intact. By mid-afternoon, the house had filled with a specific kind of noise that belongs to backyard parties in American neighborhoods: the clink of ice against plastic cups, the bounce of a Bluetooth speaker trying its best with an old playlist, the gentle theater of adults asking teenagers about college plans they barely cared to hear, and through it Rachel shone with the bright, unscuffed confidence of the chosen child, her hair sprayed into place like a promise, her laughter landing on people as a kind of currency, while my mother hovered nearby handing out napkins and anecdotes as if both were proof of good parenting, and my father did that thing where he claps a man on the shoulder and widens his stance as though authority is a posture. When the time came to move everyone to the driveway, there was a little parade through the side gate, and I walked with them, holding my phone like everyone else, but my camera was not pointed at the bow under the sun or at Rachel's glittering face. It was pointed at the crowd, at the faces of the people who would witness what came next, because I had learned that in a family that refuses to see you, strangers become mirrors. My father tugged the tarp and the bow trembled, and then there it was, a brand new car bright enough to squint at, the kind of gleaming promise that makes a teenager feel ordained and a parent feel absolved. And there was a ripple of delighted gasps as if generosity were a weather event, while my mother dabbed her eyes and said something about how their little girl deserved the best because she worked so hard and never asked for much, which would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so familiar. And Rachel hopped in the driver's seat with an ease that told me she had been practicing the gesture in her head for weeks. I stood slightly back, not because I wanted to be small, but because I needed the full frame, and when my father held up the keys and asked for a cheer, I felt the old burn in my chest try to rise. The one that says do not say anything because it will be twisted into ingratitude, and then I felt something sturdier take its place, a calmer heat that said speak now, but do it like a surgeon, not a street fighter. So I lifted my voice not with a plea but with a toast, a smooth little monologue I had rehearsed in my head while tying ribbons and aligning forks, and I said that this was a beautiful day for Rachel, a day to celebrate all the milestones that shape a family's memory, and that I had brought a small surprise of my own to honor what consistent celebration really looked like in our house, after which I gave a discreet nod toward the curb where a delivery van idled like a patient accomplice. The driver stepped out carrying a sheet cake so large it required both hands, and when he set it on the folding table and pulled away the cardboard lid, a neat line of silence cut through the crowd, because piped in immaculate script across the frosting were the words, "Happy birthday to the daughter you forgot 5 times, followed by my name, spelled correctly for once, and in smaller letters the dates of each missed year, which I had double-checked against the calendar that lived on our refrigerator. Like a record of national holidays that somehow never included me. People laughed the way they do when something lands between joke and indictment, a careful, nervous sound, and my mother went pale in the precise pattern of someone realizing the punchline has receipts, while my father tried to call it a prank gone wrong. But I kept my smile steady and my tone kind, because nothing is more disarming than courtesy wrapped around a blade. I thanked everyone for coming. I congratulated Rachel on her car with genuine warmth, because her entitlement was a symptom, not the disease, and then, holding a plastic knife that bent under the weight of the frosting, I cut a generous slice, placed it on a plate, and slid my house key into the soft middle where it stood like a flag on a newly claimed continent, after which I handed the plate to my mother and told her it was sweet and heavy and she should be careful not to drop it, which earned a ripple of confused laughter that turned into a hush as the meaning clicked into place. My mother whispered my name as though volume could summon obedience. My father called me dramatic in that tired tone that men keep for the women they have decided to underestimate, and Rachel rolled her eyes in a way that said this was, as usual, about me ruining things, while behind them the neighbors pretended to check their phones, except they were recording, and the little red lights of their screens were more honest than any of our faces. The party tried to reboot itself, like a computer with too many tabs open, but the music sounded thin and the compliments ran out of air, and my mother struggled to hold the plate without letting the key sink into the frosting. And my father made a speech about gratitude that might have landed if he hadn't paused right before my name as though it were a word in a foreign language, and I felt a strange quiet bloom inside me, not triumph exactly, but the relief of pushing a boulder and finally hearing it roll. I hugged two aunts who have always smelled like perfume and realism. I thanked the delivery driver with a tip I could barely afford. And then I stepped away from the driveway while the bow flapped in the late light and Rachel revved the engine, as if volume could drown memory, and I realized the most radical gift I could give myself wasn't vengeance, clever as it had been, but absence. I walked past the mailbox with its cheerful balloons, past the pie that tasted like guilt, and as I turned the corner I decided that before the sun rose again I would perform one last vanishing act that no one at that house was expecting, which is why the next sound I heard, much later, was not a door closing behind me but a knock I would make them chase for a very long time. I did not leave that night in a blaze of melodrama with suitcases banging down the porch steps and neighbors peeking through their blinds like we were giving them a free episode of cable, because I had learned that the most effective exits are the quiet ones that trade spectacle for precision, so I placed my bedroom key next to the house key already marinating in frosting, took one last look at the dent on my wall where I had once taped a birthday banner for myself, and walked out with a backpack that held exactly what mattered, a folder of documents, a second-hand laptop that overheated like a nervous chihuahua, and the conviction that if I didn't draw a line now I would be tracing the same old circle for the rest of my life. The apartment I found 2 neighborhoods over was the kind of place where shampoo bottles double as decor and every sound from the hallway becomes a character in your life. Yet when I turned the deadbolt for the first time and leaned against the door, I felt a steadiness I had never felt in a house with a manicured lawn and a garage full of holiday bins, because it turns out freedom does not require square footage, only a door that locks from the inside and a calendar that finally has your name on it. I changed my number after one long evening of drafting a message I never sent, the kind of manifesto that starts strong and ends up bloated with examples no one would admit to. And instead I opted for that surprisingly radical modern act, which is to simply remove access, to let the silence say what my voice had begged to say for years, and then I did something else that felt petty and holy at once. I logged into the family phone plan that I had been quietly managing since high school because, apparently, the daughter you forget on her birthday is the same daughter you trust with passwords, and I removed myself with a clean click that left me footing my own bill for the first time and them holding a small, inconvenient gap where I used to be. A tiny accounting of absence that would repeat itself in places they had never thought to look. I forwarded my mail. I updated emergency contacts at my doctor's office so that the nurse with the sensible shoes would call my friend Camila instead of my mother if a crisis ever came, and I sent my mother an email with the subject line "off your plate" that contained a tidy spreadsheet of everything I had handled over the years: insurance reminders, school portal logins, Even the password to the thermostat app, each line item crossed out with a note that said no longer applicable, which was my way of returning the invisible labor they had never thanked me for with a receipt they had never asked to see. The first week tasted like a dare, not because I expected a knock at the door, but because I half expected myself to cave, to call home and make a joke about running away like I was still a teenager with a drama streak and a full tank. Yet what arrived instead were the predictable pings that always follow a woman who refuses to be the family cork in the bottle, texts from my father that began with measured patience and ended with managerial irritation, voicemails from my mother that opened with soft-voiced worry and slipped into the familiar nudge of guilt, and a series of breezy messages from Rachel that combined a selfie with the car and a throwaway line about how I was doing the most, as if the only thing I had ever wanted was a shinier stage. I did not respond, not because I enjoyed the power of withholding, but because every reply would have been an invitation to replay a scene I had already performed 5 different ways, and I had promised myself a new script. Instead, I crafted my revenge in the same register as my departure, which is to say careful, undeniable, and laced with enough wit to keep me from crying on the bus. I designed small, surgical reminders that the daughter they had learned to overlook had been, in fact, the quiet scaffolding of their convenience. So I mailed a stack of laminated wallet cards to my parents with emergency information updated to exclude them, tucked inside a cheerful greeting that read, "Simplifying things," since apparently I excel at being low maintenance. And I sent a polite letter to our church office asking them to remove me from the prayer chain because I preferred not to be a name on a list that never remembered to call when candles mattered, and I even dropped off a labeled box on the porch, house keys, childhood trophies, the engraved pen from a scholarship dinner no one attended. Because sometimes the only way to stop being the lost and found is to stop being available for retrieval. For the neighbors who had filmed my frosting manifesto, I created a thank you note as dry as saltines, thanking them for their attendance and their accidental documentation with a line at the bottom that read, "Please share any footage in which I appear to be ruining the day," which, judging by the 3 emails that landed in my new inbox by morning, they found either hilarious or liberating, and in either case, useful. The real payoff, though, arrived courtesy of logistics rather than theatrics, because within 2 weeks the family group chat, still visible to me on the old laptop I had once used to book dental appointments for everyone who never missed Rachel's cleanings, began to read like minutes from a meeting where the agenda item was me, with my mother asking if anyone knew the Wi-Fi password, my father posting a photo of a blinking thermostat like it had staged a coup, and Rachel whining that the car insurance portal demanded a code I used to receive, which is when I allowed myself one small, uncharitable laugh that felt less like cruelty and more like balance returning to a room that had been tilted for years. I typed a single message into the chat, polite, precise, impossible to misunderstand, in which I explained that I had relinquished all household management and would no longer be available for tech support, calendar triage, or peacekeeping, and then, in a flourish I admit I enjoyed more than I should have, I attached a link to a shared drive containing clearly labeled instructions titled, "How to Function Without Your Forgotten Daughter," after which I signed out and shut the lid as firmly as if it were a chapter. That might have been the end of it if absence worked like a switch instead of a slow, humming transformer, but in families like ours panic doesn't visit all at once, it arrives in installments. With my aunt calling to say my parents had started explaining me to people in that syrupy way that makes negligence sound like a misunderstanding, and with Rachel posting a smug story about how some of us thrive on drama while others thrive on new car scent, which would have stung if I hadn't already decided that envy dies when attention is rationed. Still, I could feel the old ache pacing the perimeter of my new life, so I gave it one more task, something undeniably theatrical, but still inside the lines of civility, and I mailed an invitation to my parents' house addressed to them in my own hand, inviting them to a belated birthday dinner in honor of their eldest daughter, with a date set exactly 5 weeks after my move and a small note at the bottom that read, "Hosted by your absence, RSVP. Required," a gesture both petty and clean, because it offered them the performance they seemed to need while making it crystal clear who had written the script this time. When the evening came and they opened their front door to find a white table set on the porch with a single place setting, a candle burned down to a nub, and a printed photo of my teenage face taped to the chair back like a name card. The neighborhood once again became my witness, and by the time my phone lit up with my mother's number, I already knew that the next knock I would hear would not be metaphorical at all, which is why, when it finally rattled my apartment door a few days later, I stood there with my hand on the chain and wondered whether opening it would be justice, mercy, or just another way to get pulled back into a role I had finally outgrown. The first time the knock landed on my door, it sounded tentative, like a question that didn't have the courage to become a sentence, and I stood behind the chain with my breath held as if oxygen were a negotiation. Because I already knew that if I opened it too quickly, I would tumble back into the old choreography where my mother spoke in soft apologies that never contained the word sorry, and my father explained the nature of busyness, as though calendars were dictators. So instead I waited in the hush of my own small apartment and let the silence perform the lesson I had tried to teach with words, and after a long minute the footsteps receded down the hall, leaving behind a paper bag with a foil pan of lasagna that smelled like the version of love my family could understand, which is to say edible and easily reheated. And I slid it into my refrigerator not because I wanted their comfort, but because I liked the idea of keeping their efforts chilled until I chose what to do with them. In the days that followed, the house I had left began to buckle under the weight of my absence in ways I had predicted with almost scientific pettiness, with the thermostat stuck on some stubborn schedule my father could not master, with the church volunteer list missing my name and therefore missing a dependable body, with Rachel discovering that insurance portals do not salute charm, and the group chat, now a museum exhibit on my old laptop, filled with new artifacts of frustration that sounded like justice, not because I wanted them to suffer, though I won't pretend I didn't savor it, but because the redistribution of labor in a family that has mistaken a daughter for a resource was always going to feel like an earthquake to those who benefited most from the fault line. I did not spend my time gloating, at least not exclusively, because self-respect that depends on someone else's stumble ages badly, so I built a routine that felt like scaffolding rather than glitter, with early morning walks that traced a steady loop past tidy apartment windows where people fought and reconciled and reheated leftovers just like me, with a job schedule that stretched me without swallowing me, and with a quiet promise to myself that I would replace each reflex to fix my family's discomfort with a practice that fixed my own, and, because I am my mother's daughter in at least one useful way, I organized my healing like a project, with lists and timelines and deliverables that included unglamorous things like updating my will template, booking my annual exam, and finally learning how to roast a chicken without calling someone else for the oven temperature. Still, there was a part of me that enjoyed the theater of restitution, and so I staged one more piece of carefully weaponized honesty that felt like both an art project and a deposition, a slim photo book I mailed to our extended relatives titled The Years We Skipped, whose pages were stark and deliberate. 5 spreads of clean white paper labeled with the birthdays my parents had sailed past, each caption printed in the same neat script as the frosting on the driveway cake, and on the last page a photograph of that party. The bow blinking in the sunlight while I stood slightly apart, smiling like a woman who had finally met the terms of her own contract. The reaction arrived like weather moving across a map, first with polite inquiries from cousins who wanted to get both sides, then with a tight voicemail from my father accusing me of public humiliation, as if truth were a rash I had spread deliberately. And finally with a single text from my mother that contained 10 words and 2 truths: "You have made your point, and I am embarrassed," which would have satisfied me once upon a time because embarrassment can feel like confession if you squint. Except I no longer accepted discounts on apologies, so I replied with one long message that laid out the terms of continued distance in practical language that left no room for sentimentality to bargain, a short course titled How to Love a Daughter You Forgot, which insisted on 3 simple pillars: no revisionist history, no triangulation through Rachel or my aunt, and no contact that pretended birthdays were accidents rather than choices. Predictably, Rachel broke the second rule within hours, sending me a photo from the passenger seat of her car with the caption, "They're miserable. I hope that helps, and although a younger version of me would have fired back a scalding essay about the difference between misery and responsibility, I settled for a polite thumbs up that communicated nothing and everything at once. Word of my photo book did what I suspected it would do in a town where reputations are as fragile as pie crusts, and my parents began to experience the social version of a mirror, which is to say people started reflecting back what they had once ignored. With an usher at church asking my mother, too brightly, whether she had plans for my belated celebration, with a neighbor delivering a stray package and remarking that family is complicated in a tone that was not unkind, but certainly not neutral, and with my father discovering that men who had clapped him on the shoulder at the driveway party were suddenly eager to discuss weather rather than daughters. A cool drift of consequence that had nothing to do with vindictiveness and everything to do with gravity. I engineered one last, smaller revenge that was less spectacle and more audit, a set of automatic email forwards that sent every outdated reminder I had once handled oil change appointments, dental cleanings, the annual nuisance of property tax deadlines back to their own inboxes stamped with the subject line I used on all my boundary correspondence, off your plate, and while this sounds petty when summarized, living it felt like the slow, correct placement of items back into hands that had mistaken me for a countertop. Eventually the knocks returned, no longer tentative but paced like someone practicing patience, and I let 2 of them pass because I wanted to see if persistence could hold without sliding into pressure. And then on a cold evening when the hallway smelled like old paint and new takeout, I looked through the peephole and saw my mother framed in the fisheye with a bakery box balanced in both hands and a confusion of hope on her face. A look that belonged to the woman who taught me how to braid. And the woman who forgot my birthday, and the woman who was trying to become a third thing I had not yet met. I didn't open the door, not yet, because I had promised myself that my forgiveness would never again be an emergency service, and also because I noticed something almost imperceptible peeking from under the twine on the box. A small silver glint that could have been a decorative charm, or could have been my house key washed and resurrected from a cake I had weaponized, and they had not. Understood. And I stood there with my hand on the chain and my heart doing that serrated dance it does when history and possibility collide, and I said through the door, calm and steady, that if she wanted to speak she could come back tomorrow at 6 with no audience and no props, which is why, when I slid the chain back into place and leaned my head against the cool wood, I realized I had just set the stage for a conversation that could rewrite our family's grammar or shatter it completely. And either way I would be the one choosing the punctuation. When 6 o'clock came the next evening I heard the knock again, firmer than before but not hostile, the kind of knock that carried the weight of someone rehearsing sentences in their car before daring to walk up the stairs. And as I stood behind the door with the chain still latched, I wondered whether this moment would become the prologue to reconciliation or the punctuation at the end of everything. I let the silence stretch long enough for her to shift her weight and sigh. Then I opened the door halfway and saw my mother standing there without balloons, without a bow, without even the armor of brisk cheer she so often used to disguise discomfort. Only a plain white bakery box held in both hands and eyes that looked both tired and searching. She said my name quietly, the way someone says it at a hospital bedside, and she lifted the box slightly as if it could speak for her. Inside was a small cake with uneven frosting, clearly not professional, with my name scrawled in shaky letters. And for a second, I was transported back to the birthdays that had never happened, the silent dinners, the candle that never flickered, the way I used to whisper happy birthday to myself in the bathroom mirror. And all of that pressed against this one imperfect gesture like a bruise beneath a bandage. I didn't invite her in, not yet, because opening a door is easy but reopening history is something else entirely, and so we stood in the narrow hallway with the hum of the building's old radiator filling the spaces between our words. She told me she and Dad had not realized what their silence had done, that they had let routine and convenience dictate love, and that it took the spectacle of my absence to make them see how fragile their family actually was. I wanted to laugh because 5 forgotten birthdays had not been fragile, they had been deliberate, and no parent simply forgets half a decade of milestones unless the forgetting itself serves some function. But I bit it back because there was something raw in her voice that felt different, like a draft of honesty that hadn't been edited for public view. She said Rachel drove the car every day, proud and happy, but that lately even Rachel had stopped posting about it, because every photograph carried the shadow of my protest, the cake. With its sharp lettering, the whispering neighbors, the extended family who now looked at my parents with narrowed eyes. "We can't escape what you did," she admitted, and for once it didn't sound like an accusation, but like a confession that maybe, finally, she understood that forgetting a child is not something you erase with one grand gesture of generosity toward another. I told her I wasn't interested in apologies that existed only because people were watching, and that if she had come here to repair a reputation rather than a relationship, she could leave the cake and walk away, but she shook her head quickly and said, "No. I came because you made me realize we raised one daughter like she was the whole sky and the other like she was just weather passing through, and I don't know how to undo that." Her words landed heavily, and I found myself leaning against the doorframe not because I was tired, but because I wasn't prepared for honesty that cut that close to the bone. For a moment, I wanted to ask her why it had taken me vanishing, why it had taken public embarrassment, why it had taken neighbors whispering and relatives murmuring for her to finally articulate what I had known at 16. But instead, I asked the question that had been pulsing in my chest for years. "Would you have ever remembered me if I hadn't forced you?" She didn't answer. Immediately, and in that pause I realized the power of silence isn't only in what it withholds, but in what it demands. Finally, she said, "Maybe not soon enough," and though it wasn't the answer I wanted, it was at least real. I took the cake from her hands because leaving her standing there with it felt cruel, and when our fingers brushed I remembered all the years when I had reached out in quieter ways and been met with distraction. And I wondered whether this moment was too little too late or whether it was the first honest exchange we had ever managed. She asked if she could come inside, and I told her not yet, because forgiveness isn't a living room you can just walk into after ignoring the house for years, and she nodded as though she understood, even if she didn't. She turned to leave, and I watched her walk down the hallway with her shoulders slightly bent, carrying the weight of her own history in a way I had never seen before, and I closed the door slowly, placing the cake on the counter like an artifact rather than a dessert. I didn't eat it, not that night, not ever. I kept it in the refrigerator until the frosting hardened and the letters sagged, because it wasn't food, it was proof. As I sat in the quiet, the apartment humming around me, I realized that the fallout I had imagined as fiery and destructive was instead slow and lingering, like ash that drifts into every corner and refuses to be swept out. And that even though my parents were now forced to face their neglect, I was left with the choice of whether to rebuild with them or build further away. The truth was, I didn't know what I would choose, not yet. Maybe the next knock would be Rachel, maybe it would be my father, maybe it would never come at all, but the ambiguity was the only honest ending I could accept, because some stories don't close neatly, they stay open like windows that let in both light and draft. All I knew was that after 5 forgotten birthdays, 1 glittering car, and the silence of my own absence, my parents had finally remembered me, but the question that would haunt all of us now was whether remembering was ever enough.